Welcome to How to Cook That. I'm Ann Reardon, and it's that time of year again when it's getting close to Christmas. This year I decided to make a gravity-defying gingerbread house inspired by the Up movie house. I made a simpler version of this many years ago and I didn't film how to make it, I just made it and took a few photos. So this time I'm going to try and make it even better. The first thing you'll need to do is print out the template that I made all those years ago. Now, if any gingerbread house has this many pieces, you should know that it's a complicated one and probably not for beginners. I have this gingerbread house template and several other easier ones on the howtocookthat.net website for you, and all the recipe quantities and details that I've used in this house are there too. I am going to make a couple of adjustments. Last time I made all the balcony rails out of gingerbread, and this time I'm going to do them out of fondant so they can be a bit finer and a bit more detailed. So I'm just going to get rid of those bits from the template. Now, to make the gingerbread dough, we are going to need 3 batches of this. For each batch we have flour, sugar, and then for our syrups we have molasses and glucose syrup. You can swap this for corn syrup and you can swap this for golden syrup or honey, but it will affect the flavour, the colour and the texture of your dough. We have milk, butter, and then we have our spices and baking powder. With the spices I've got cloves, cinnamon and ginger. You can vary the amounts of these completely or leave them out, whatever flavour you want. Muck around with the spices all you like. First thing we need to do is melt our butter, and you can do that in the microwave or on the stovetop, and then add in the sugar and the glucose syrup and the molasses and give that a stir. Then you can add in your milk and again give it a stir around, and then it's time to add the flour and all your spices, whatever you've chosen to put in there, and the baking powder, and stir that all together until you have a thick, soft dough. Tip that gingerbread dough onto some plastic wrap and wrap it up firmly, and you want to place that in the fridge, and as the butter cools down your dough is going to get thicker, and we need to make of course the 2 more batches of this. You couldn't make it all at once unless you have a ginormous mixing bowl. Next I want you to lay out all your template pieces onto pieces of baking paper so you know which pieces will fit on which trays and how many trays you're going to need, so you know how much you need to split your dough up between the trays. Put the dough onto some baking paper, sprinkle it with some flour on top so the rolling pin doesn't stick, and roll it out to the size of your tray. Place your pieces on top and cut around the template. Now you can see here I've cut around the template, but then I've also left a gap or a border of dough, and the reason I've done that is twofold. 1, because it helps stop it spreading out, and 2, it stops the corners from burning in the oven. Now the other important thing is to make sure you take the template off before you bake it. I've forgotten to do that before, and then the template sticks. And also halfway through baking, pull it out and redo these cuts just to make sure that they stay all the way through rather than fusing together. So slide that onto a baking tray and bake it in the oven. Once it is baked and cooled, check your pieces are firm enough. I've got some of the scraps here to show you. This one is really soft and this one is really hard, and it's the exact same dough. The only difference is how long it was baked for. So if it's soft after it's cooled, just chuck it back in the oven for a little bit longer just to dry it out. Give it an extra 5 or 10 minutes and then cool it again and you should be good to go. Once all the pieces are baked and cooled, lay out the back side and front walls. And I always used to use royal icing for putting gingerbread houses together, but now I quite like using compound chocolate because it sets firm faster. You'll notice here that I have the back wall on the inside and the side walls on the outside. That makes a difference as to how everything fits together. And I've cut myself a baseboard in the shape of the house and put a hole in it. You'll need to do that too if you're wanting it to float. If you don't want it to float, you can just use a blank board in a normal shape rectangle board to put your house on. Add the front wall and then the 3 bits of the bay window. Now before you add chocolate to these, check that they all sit neatly together. Because the gingerbread can spread out a bit and it's quite thick, you may need to just sort of adjust them slightly. The best way to do that is using a fine grater and just grate some of the gingerbread off so that they fit together on that angle there. Then add that little bit just next to the front door. Now this area here is raised for the front porch, so add that rectangle into place there, and then the front piece across at the bottom. And then also at the top of the porch, there's another piece that goes across there. Now before we put the roof on, you need to decide what you want to do with your windows. Do you want to leave them plain, or do you want to put some gelatin sheets on the inside so that you can't just see straight in, so that it gives that sort of windowy look? I'm going to go with the gelatin sheets, and I'm just attaching them with white chocolate. Add the ledge to the top of the bay window and over the porch as well. And then put the section above the bay window into place. Then add the sticky out bits on the side section of the house. And then you can start adding all your roof pieces. Now you can see why this template had so many parts. It's quite a complicated house design, because when they were designing it for the movie, they weren't thinking about people making it as a gingerbread house, clearly. Before you put this last bit of roof on, you will need to make two decisions. One, do you want lollies or lights inside your house? And two, do you want the balloon coming out of the chimney? Because if you do, you need to put the support rod into place now, otherwise you're not going to be able to secure it in there. First things first, if you want it to float, you're going to need a big solid MDF board with a nut underneath holding the rod in, and a washer and a nut on top, and make sure you've tightened that really well. Decide what height you want your house to be floating, add another nut there, and then add a washer, and then add the house down over the top and support that with your hand while you try and screw another nut all the way down the support rod down to the top of the board inside the house, and then tighten that up from the underneath. Again, this needs to be really tight to hold it in place. You probably should use a wooden board for under the house rather than cardboard, but I didn't, because I didn't want to saw the wooden board. Hopefully it is strong enough to hold. And then you can add the last two big pieces of roof into place, and I've just cut an extra piece out on this so that it will fit around the rod there. Add the little extra window and the two little roof pieces on that side there on the front. And now for the balloon. I have another piece of rod and a coupler so that I can join it to the rod coming out of the house. For the balloon, put some marshmallows into a bowl and microwave them until they are melted. Look at that gooey melted marshmallows. Then add in rice bubbles and stir them together. And yes, they are called rice bubbles here in Australia. That's what it says on the packet, and that's what we call them. I like to use cheaper, chewier marshmallows for this because they set a bit firmer than the soft ones. Line a bowl with baking paper and scoop in the marshmallow rice bubble mixture and push it down firmly. If it's sticking to your hands, just dampen your hands slightly. Add the central support rod, and to give that a bit more support, I'm pouring in some melted compound white chocolate. That's just going to grip onto the metal rod and also spread out so that it stays firm and together. I'm using some sticky tape just to support that rod while I add more of the marshmallow mixture. If you've got someone who can just hold it for you, that will do too. Make another batch and build it up on top of the bowl until you get a nice balloon shape. Once you're happy with the shape, you can cover the whole thing in deep blue fondant. Then, using a little bit of water, add a sugared almond or whatever candy you think looks like individual balloons onto your big balloon shape. Using just water worked fine to attach them when the balloon was sloping, but when it got to vertical they started sliding off, so I'm going to have to let that side dry before turning it over and doing the other side. It's now 3 a.m. in the morning, so I'm going to head to bed and continue this tomorrow. Moving on to making the decorations. For the coloured cladding, I'm just cutting strips of fondant and I'm going to leave them to dry out so they're easy to get onto the house looking perfectly straight, which is quite hard to do with strips of soft fondant. I'm making them a bit longer than I think they need to be so that I can just cut them to shape as we decorate the house. This is easy, but it's actually quite repetitive because all the sides have different coloured cladding, so you need to make lots and lots and lots of strips of fondant. For the windows, lay out thin strips, yes, more strips of fondant, followed by some more strips going across. Now, I've just measured the windows using a ruler on the house to see how big they actually are now that it's baked. Everything can spread and move a little bit in gingerbread. That's why I'm measuring it off the baked house and not off the template. Leave them to dry out a bit and then trim off the excess bits around the edges, and then add a border of light wood colour over the top of each window. Now around the base of the house all the way round there's rectangle panels of wood with a border of a different coloured wood over the top. Now I've just used my knife to make indents in the rectangle part so it looks like it's got diagonal planks, but it's just actually one piece of fondant, and then I'm adding those extra strips around the edge. For the columns on the front of the house, I'm making them out of fondant rolled quite thickly, and then I'm just cutting a slice to make a square column. Once you have 3 of those cut, line them up together and then just use a ruler or the back of a knife to indent them all at the same level. Then add the handrail and the spindles, and to join this together just use a little bit of water and it will join the fondant to itself. The hose reel is of course an important part of this gingerbread house because it's used to pull the house along in the movie. So make a circle of black and then put a dot of black in the middle and overlay that with 2 strips of black and then trim them to size and leave them to dry out. While you've got your black fondant out, roll out a tiny, tiny thin snake of black and make it into a number 1 and a number 8 to go on the front pillar. It's tiny details like this which make the house look really good. Can you guess what this next detail is that I'm making? It's certainly not perfect, but it's going to have to do for the weather vane. It's supposed to be a weird looking rooster thing that they have. Poke some spaghetti into it for the support and we'll be able to poke that into the top of the house. Now for the strings to hold the balloons. If you want to, you can roll these by hand. Have fun doing that. If not, get a cheap fondant extruder and make lots of them at once and then straighten them out and leave them to dry. Also use the extruder to make a hose and wrap that around the reel until you're happy that you've got enough of the hose on there. Make a rectangle out of fondant and add that into place around the support rod for your chimney. Once it is in the right spot, then you can just shape that and make sure it's square. Then add a strip around the top to make it look a bit more chimney-like. Add some wood-coloured fondant onto the front porch, trim it to shape, and then use a ruler or the back of a knife to just indent planks where wooden planks would be. Moving on to the roof, add a strip of fondant along the bottom of your roof and indent it at various intervals there, and then continue to add more layers up the roof in slightly different coloured neutral shades of fondant all the way up to the top. Add a piece along the bottom, and again I'm using compound chocolate for this because it sets faster and holds it really firm. You could use royal icing here if you wanted to though. Then add the cladding into place, trimming each one as you go to exactly the right length and slightly overlapping one over the top of the next one. Now I'm doing the back of the house first so I can iron out any problems and figure out anything I'm not happy with before I get to the front. They look pretty good, but if you look at the side here, there's a gap at the corners where they join. So on the front, I'm going to need to cut the side bits on an angle so that it meets, which is going to take a little bit longer, but it'll make it look really good. Adding all this cladding took so long to do over the whole house. It does look good, but be warned, if you want to do it, it takes a long time. Add the door into place and then put a strip of blue along the roof edges there, and add all the windows into place. The underneath of the roof also needs to be blue, so just use your leftover strips of blue to do under there. The front of the house has some fish scale cladding, and I'm doing this with soft, freshly rolled fondant because it needs to be curved. I don't really have a cutter small enough, so I'm just using bigger fish scale sizing, using the rose cutter that I had. And then adding that across, and I used chocolate underneath it to make it curved like it is on the up house. Then add that window into place there. And onto the bit that I've been avoiding because it's a fiddly bit, all the front details. Now to the left-hand side of the house, add in some electrical boxes and some cords. They all flash and make noises when the house first takes off. Add a fuse box to the back of the house and then get some more sleep because it's been a really long day. The next day, get someone strong and handsome to help you lift up the balloon so you can attach it using the coupler. Thanks, Dave. And then you can add the rest of the sugared almonds. Now I'm using blue royal icing now instead of just using water so that they'll stay on when it's on the upright slope, and that seems to be much easier. Then cover the rest of the balloon with the sugared almonds using any smaller ones at the top so it looks like the tops of balloons. To cover the support rod, you need to make more snakes of white using the fondant extruder and add them on over the rod, just trimming them off at the bottom. Once you have lots of them there, add some of the dry ones that you made earlier, just poking them into the fondant at the bottom and using a little bit of royal icing at the top to hold it onto the balloon. Now these are really fragile, so if you intend on moving your gingerbread house to another person's house to eat it, I'd do all of these strings once you get there. That way you can transport it with the balloon off too, which would be a bit easier. Add in the weather vane. That looks okay now, it's on the top of the house. And then to cover the board, chop some Oreos in a food processor, or if you don't have a food processor, just put them in a bag and bash them with a rolling pin. That works just as well. Cover the foil on the board with melted chocolate and then sprinkle under the house where it's just lifted off with Oreo dirt all the way under there. Then cover the rest of the board with coconut that's been coloured with some green food colouring. You just put it in a bowl, add some green food colouring and mix it through. If you're using gel colour, you will need to water it down before you add it in. Put the hose reel into place. It's not quite sitting on there because the cladding is sitting out a bit, so I'm just going to build it up with a couple more bits of cladding so that it's at the same level, and then add that back on the front there. And at long last, after days of working on it, the gingerbread house is finally finished. Wow, that was a huge effort. I think that it looks pretty cool though in the end. I'd rather it was floating a little bit higher, but there's no way I'm going to risk trying to undo that and move it up. I don't even think that would be possible at this stage, but if you're making it, you can do it. If you make this, make sure you take a photo of it and upload it in the comments section on the website so the rest of the world can see it too. With thanks to my patrons for supporting this channel. You guys are amazing. I wouldn't be able to spend time doing this sort of thing for you without your support. Merry Christmas to all of you. Subscribe to How to Cook That for more cool stuff and watch more of my videos to help me out. Make it a great week and I'll see you on Friday.